Hello class, and let's get into our process of evolution part 2. So we're going to take a look at the study guide here and see what sort of things that we can learn from it. So yesterday's lesson was all about the processes of evolution and how random chance can cause things for asexually reproducing organisms to change, right? This was the focus of genetic drift and the various things. And hopefully you got the idea that it was a set of randomness, that sometimes randomly things will change. The This lesson is all about non-random situations, things that are actually causing changes to happen for a particular reason, not just because it happens to change. So the first thing that we're going to talk about in this is that evolution or changes in species can occur through non-random mating. What mating that occurs when animals or organisms choose mates based on particular traits. This means that the mating isn't some random thing. The mating is always chosen, and this will particularly lead to certain things being favored and other things being not. So non-random mating, it's going to favor traits that draw mates. That's kind of a unintentional rhyme there, but non-random mating favors traits that draw mates, and this could either be through a display or ability of the creature. So this non-random mating, if we take a look at a couple examples, we see here's a peacock with this brilliant display of tail feathers. Well, why do peacock males, why do the peafowl and the peacock being the male of that, why do they have such brilliant tail feathers that are clearly not particularly useful in terms of being able to run away from predators or that sort of thing? Is because the ones that have a more visible plumage make themselves more attractive to the peahen, the female of the peafowl. And since this is non-random mating, they look at these tail feathers and say, that's good. Then it means that the large tail feathers are going to be more prominent. And over time, the larger displays keep getting chosen. So that means the entire species of peafowl, the males tend to always have larger and larger displays, to the point that they seem to be so exaggerated that I don't even think that a peacock can actually fly, because those tail feathers are just so large. So this was an example of how a change has occurred through non-random mating. Another example here is the bighorn sheep. The rams, the males will butt heads with the other ones, and whoever has effectively the hardest head, whoever's most effective at, butting heads with other rings, that's where the female or the ewe is going to actually choose that one. So the peacock has a pure display, and the ram has a test, an ability, and both of these are going to lead to sheep that now have big horns, right? Because the ones with the biggest horns and the hardest horns are going to be better at butting heads with each other, and that led to these sheep having very large horns, which is more actually useful than, say, the peacock's tail feathers, because those large horns can be now a defense mechanism against certain predators. All right, so our first way of saying how can we change a species that isn't just through sets of randomness, that isn't caused by genetic drift like our founder effect or our bottleneck effect, right, is through just non-random mating. And this is a matter of natural selection, because the creatures themselves are choosing, or the environment is allowing certain things to live, and then the creatures themselves are choosing these traits because they find that those are attractive or somehow beneficial traits. So let's talk about natural selection or selective pressures. So selective pressures work by giving an organism, an individual, um, with certain traits advantage for survival and reproduction. So the goal here is that the selective pressures say, hey, that trait is particularly good, and that's going to give them an advantage for survival and reproduction. So a selective pressure is something that helps them. The advantage given by the selective pressure, in other words, the advantage that this certain trait is giving for this pressure, increases the proportion of the species that will have the favorable trait. So this is natural selection at work. So the idea here, right, to go over our points of natural selection again, is that something will have traits that are favorable, and those will allow it to survive and reproduce more than other things that don't have the certain or the same level of trait, and so that means they'll be able to reproduce, which means the overall proportion or the overall amount that have those favorable traits will get larger. With our selection pressures here is they can be density dependent. So that means they're affected by the size of the population. An example of a density-dependent pressure would be diseases. If there's an incredibly large population, it will actually be able to survive that disease far more, and so the disease won't have as much of a pressure or as much of an effect on the overall population if it was a large one. Alternatively, if there's a small population, a disease could possibly wipe the whole population out, or wipe out the trait, wipe out all the ones who don't have some resistance to it. Alternately, it could be density independent, which is not going to not being affected by population size. This more or less could be something like climate. This means something in a hot deserty area. It doesn't matter if there are a lot of desert animals or a small number of desert animals. They're all going to be affected by the hot desert conditions the same way. And so that selective pressure of the abiotic condition of the climate will not depend on the population of the animals themselves. So the big idea, and that's why I have it bolded and italicized, is the idea here of pressures or selective pressures. These are external factors that influence how well an organism can survive and reproduce. They can cause organisms with certain traits to have an advantage over others, or put those organisms at a disadvantage as well. So the pressure is not the trait that the animal has, but the pressure is what is occurring around it that causes traits to either be good or traits to be bad. So there are overall 3 broad scopes of selective pressures. The first one is the availability of resources, and the availability of resources here are simply just the amount of food, water, shelter, or mates that are available. So an example here would be a lack of mates. That's correct. Mates are a resource. A lack of mates in a population of peacocks will actually put a pressure um, on the population. Puts a pressure on the males, the peacocks, to have more beautiful tail feathers. Because they are now pressured to have more beautiful feathers because the other animal, because they won't get chosen for reproduction if they don't have them. So that's an example on how mates are actually a resource that we would consider when talking about selective pressures. There are environmental factors that can change things. So this would be stuff like the weather conditions, temperature, and the ability to reach other places. So the ability to migrate or even to move around in areas. So these environmental factors put pressures on animals as well. Example here is the snow in a tundra location will put a pressure on many different animals. It'll put pressure on a lot of prey animals to be white so they can survive so they can be camouflaged. And they might put a pressure, for example, on trees so they develop leaf shapes that can shed snow. Because if they can't, then the snow will just get too heavy on it and will actually break the trees. So the idea here is the pressure is the snow, and it causes things that can't shed snow to die out, causing the overall populations to turn into things that can. That's why we actually see all the trees in this area of the world. So we're talking about BC, and you see it more as you go to the interior and higher in the mountains, is we all have these triangular, thin-shaped trees, and it's because they can shed snow. There are also biological factors, and the most common forms that we're dealing with here, are going to be predators and diseases. And so there are tons of forms. We can talk about any set of predator-prey interactions going on here, or any sort of disease things. But here's an example: is there are some cactus-eating camels. The cactus-eating camels, they put up pressure. So the camels are now a pressure on cacti to develop like longer and sharper needles. Because camels naturally have pretty tough mouths. So if the needles get longer and even sharper, then they're going to be less likely to be eaten by camels. So that means the ones with shorter, duller needles get eaten, and then that means only the long, sharp needles survive. Here's a biological pressure provided by camels. So these are 3 forms of pressures. Yeah. Now these 3 forms of pressures can provide different forms of selection. So stabilizing selection is where a trait is already available and is favored. So what's going to happen here is stabilizing selection is that it'll keep the population relatively unchanged. So the goal here for the stabilizing selection here is that it's working, so it's not going to want to change it so much. Directional selection is the fact this is where a particular trait is favored, and it makes changes in the organism. that pushes the population to all share this trait. So an example of this could be if we had ourselves a hare, like a sort of rabbit in the tundra. If it has gray coats, it would have a kind of a variety of colors. If it has gray coats, since there's a lot of snow, the ones that are lighter gray end up being a little more camouflaged. They're more likely to survive. So that means they end up surviving. And as we can see, there's a direction towards which is a favorable trait, and that direction is a lighter color coat. And as time will go on and many generations forward, lighter coats and lighter coats keep surviving, that these normally gray hairs begin turning white because every time that lighter color ends up being more capable of surviving. So that is a directional selection. It wants to keep things moving with a particular direction in mind. Disruptive selection seems to be a little similar to directional selection. However, this is what happens here is that two or more extremes of a trait could be favored over any intermediate form of the trait. So the idea here is that being in the middle is actually bad. You can be on either end, and that will help you survive. So this actually pushes for more variety and less, and it actually eliminates more of the middle of the population. And artificial selection is the form of selection where the pressure is decided by whoever's organizing it, so by the breeders. So the traits that continue are chosen purely by the breeder. So that's kind of the big deal here is that we have four forms of selection. Stabilizing, this trait is already there, and it keeps the population to not change. There's directional selection, where it pushes the population into one particular trait. Disruptive selection, where it pushes the population into the two extremes of a trait. And artificial selection is where there's a pressure that pushes the traits that are chosen by a breeder. So let's try to take all of these ideas, talking about non-random mating, natural selective pressures, the types of pressures that we see, availability, environmental, and biological, and the types of selection that we can see here, stabilizing, directional, disruptive, and artificial, and try to apply to a case study here of mice on this beach. So here's a population of mice living on a beach where there's light color sand that's interspersed with tall, dark grasses. The climate will tend to be very mild, however it can get really cold in the winter, and there are not many competitors in this for resources in space and for the mice. However, there is a population of sight-braced predators, so we're talking things like hawks. The population of mice shows a pretty large variance in coat colors, so there's dark, medium, and light coats, and the fur length is also pretty varied. There are short, medium, and long-furred mice. So let's consider the situation and then think about these questions. So the first question, what are the selective pressures the mice are facing, and what types of pressures are these? The second, which traits are favored? Which traits will make it harder to survive? Which mice are likely to survive? Which mice will likely die? And what types of selection are likely at play? So take a moment, pause your video, and try to answer these four questions. Okay, now that you've paused and you've answered those questions, let's go over what I've tried to make us think about here. So first, what are the selective pressures the mice are facing, and what types of pressures are these? Well, we see that when I'm just reading, I'm seeing that there's light colored sand and tall dark grass. Are these a pressure? Well, this is the environment that they're living in. On its own, I don't think that those pieces on their own are a particular pressure. So I wouldn't say the sand and grass are a pressure on their own, because it's not like sand and grass make animals die. But let's look at the next point here, is the climate tends to be mild, however it can get cold in the winter. So here is an environmental pressure that this climate is going to be fairly mild, so we don't have to have tons of fur, but it does get cold, so having some fur is going to be very valuable. The next one that shows up that seems to be a really strong pressure here is our predators. Predators are those biological pressures here, and they are site-based. So we know we have a biological predator pressure. So let's consider we have two primary pressures. Climate, so our environmental climate, and our site-based predators. So with these two pressures in mind, let's take a look at the second question, which traits are favored? So when talking about climate, if it's mild but kind of gets cold, having medium size fur, having long fur are both very beneficial, because that'll be enough to take care of things, right? That'll be enough to keep you warm. Having short fur might cause a slight disadvantage, and so short fur might make it a little harder to survive. But since the climate's still mild, medium fur would be plenty enough. Long fur would be, if anything, more than enough. So those two are going to be fine. Now, how do we deal with these predators? With the predators, mice don't have a way to defend themselves against predators. It's only going to be a camouflage-based system. This is where we go back to these mice on the beach. There's light color sand and tall dark grass. So take a look at our coat color here. What's going to help with our mice living on this beach? If they're light colored mice, they might blend in with the sand. That'll make it easier for them to survive those hawks. If they're dark colored mice, they'll be very visible on the sand. That'd be dangerous. However, there's these areas of grass that'll allow them to hide in. So it could be that the grass is a great place for hiding for dark colored mice. So in this case, we can see that maybe dark is favored in certain areas and light is favored in other areas. But what's not going to work at all is the medium. Medium's not going to work in any, because if you're medium colored, you're still visible in grass, you're still visible on the sand. That's just bad for you all around. It's good to have a full dark color coat or have a full light color coat. Having the medium color coat is going to be a bad trait. So consider that. Which mice are likely to survive? Well, mice that have dark medium fur, dark long fur, those ones can survive in the grass really well. Or mice with light medium fur and light long fur, those ones can survive on the sand really well. But which ones are likely to die? Any mice with medium color fur at all, and any mice with shorter color fur. Those are the mice that are more likely to die. So that's telling us here. So we now have this population with a large level of variance, nice and even across, but with all of those ones that are dying and the ones that are left, what types of selection are at play? Well, when it comes to coat length, the fur length, I would say that we have a directional selection. It's directionally pushing a little bit towards medium and long. It's not very directional, so I could see if somebody argued stabilizing, that might be fair, because there isn't going to be a lot of variance going on there. So it's maybe a little directional, but after a few generations, it will probably turn into a stabilizing selection. In terms of the coat color, are we, like, it's not changing, it's not being exactly the same. I wouldn't say it's directional, because there isn't just one choice. There are, in fact, two choices, right? So we would say the disruptive selection is the form of selection that's at play here. And that, I think, wraps up our 4 questions there for this case study. Hopefully, you're hopefully you got those on your own, and you can see how these sort of questions you can ask yourself while looking at a case study allows you to analyze what sort of events and what sort of selective pressures may cause an animal or an organism to change or evolve over its lifespan. Thanks, everyone. Have yourself a good day.